Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I'm here to talk about the new nerfs that were just announced that are coming to Druid, but not only Druid. A handful of other cards are also getting nerfed. So real quickly, I want to jump through each of these just so you can see the nerfs. In case you haven't seen them yet, then I'll be going back and talking about each of them in more detail, essentially explaining what they mean for the game and how that's going to change the meta. Real quickly, these nerfs have not been put into the game just yet. They haven't announced when they're going to happen, just that they'll be coming soon. So up first is Innervate. Essentially, it's being cut from 2 mana that you gain down to 1 mana that you gain. Spreading Plague is also getting nerfed. They're increasing the mana cost of this card by 1 mana. Fiery War Axe, of all things, is also getting nerfed, increasing the cost by 1 mana. Hex is getting nerfed, increasing the cost by 1 mana. And then finally, Murloc Warleader is only going to give Murlocs an attack gain. It will no longer give them the +1 health buff. So some crazy changes, some unexpected changes, I think, along with the much expected and much needed nerf to Druid. Some unusual things. So let's go ahead and talk about all of these nerfs. Essentially, I'll review them, what I think they're going to mean for the game, and if Blizzard nerfed them the right way or the wrong way. So up first are the 2 Druid nerfs. Innervate, the first of those, and this was a card that a lot of people were targeting for a nerf. You know, Raynad put out a video describing in great detail why he thinks Innervate needed to be addressed. And clearly it is a powerful card. It's one of the most played cards in the game right now, if not the most played, I think, currently, according to hsreplay.net, which is ridiculous for a class card. But, of course, both the fast versions of Druid with Token Druid and the slower stuff with Jade Druid, both of them run this card, which is an indication of just how powerful it is. And, of course, Druid is the #1 class on the ladder right now across those 2 decks, making it just absurdly good. So this essentially now becomes a counterfeit coin, or just the coin. It's a 0 mana spell that gives you 1 mana. Clearly, Counterfeit Coin is a card that is played a ton in Rogue. It still synergizes really nicely with the Gadget and Auctioneer and those kinds of things. It's a little bit of ramp. So I'm not sure that Innervate's completely dead. I think it still could see play, but it's definitely not going to be played in every version of Druid. And in fact, I think the 2 current versions of Druid probably won't even find room for this card anymore, because the slower Druids have the slower turn-by-turn ramp, the Jade Blossoms, the Wild Growths, etc. And giving up a card draw and a slot in your deck for just 1 mana, 1 turn only, probably isn't fast enough for what they're trying to do with their ramp, unlike when you would gain 2 mana crystals. So, you know, just cheating out that Ultimate Infestation 1 turn earlier seems fairly weaker in comparison when you could just run other cards that do something valuable for you, even 1 mana cards, for instance, right? I think for me, when you take a card that has been okay for this long and you compare that to the cards that just put Druid over the edge in terms of power level, so the Spreading Plagues and the Ultimate Infestations, I'd rather change the cards that are new and that clearly did something to trigger this change, as opposed to the cards that have been around so long and are just a part of Hearthstone at this point and just recognizable and beloved. And if you are going to change a card like this that's just been around so long, at least just move it to the Hall of Fame so it becomes more of a Wild problem. And I don't say that just to, you know, give Wild all of standard formats problems, but it's just not as overpowered in Wild because there's so many other overpowered things that can happen in Wild format. So I would rather have seen the change directed at Ultimate Infestation. I've mentioned this a lot if you watch my streams or anything of the sort. So you're probably not surprised to hear that if you're watching me. But I do understand where Blizzard's coming from. The logic is totally fine. This card can limit design space for future cards like Vicious Fledgling and Ultimate Infestation. So I'm on board with the decision and the logic, and certainly the direction of the change, which is to limit Druid's total power level. And actually, this is the one card that targets both of their decks that are popular currently, and both of the overpowered decks currently. So you can't really go wrong from nerfing Innervate. I wish they had found a slightly more elegant or clean way to nerf Druid, but this one certainly does the job. So let's move on now to Spreading Plague, the other half of the Druid nerf. And as far as this one's concerned, I don't actually think it hurts the card that much. I mean, clearly anytime something costs more, it's just a little bit slower, it's harder to combo out with other cards. But Spreading Plague is just so decisive in what it does, if you can summon 5 or 6 1/5 taunts for this much mana, it's still a very strong play at 6 mana. This often wasn't a card that Druids were like comboing out with other things anyway. Now there has been like the taunt one that would play the Bolster Bear, as it's called, right, where you'd buff all your taunts and maybe Mark of the Lotus or Power of the Wild to buff all these taunts that you summoned. But that's a very niche execution of this card, and really it's just used in Jade Druids as a big stabilizing tool, just a big heal, basically, a big slowdown, a big reset on the board, essentially. And I think at 6 mana it remains that. Now, it does make a difference where, for instance, in a really aggressive deck, the Murloc Paladins, the Pirate Warriors of the world, will have 1 extra turn, and sometimes even more extra turns because Innervate's nerfed, to deal the lethal blow to the Druid. So perhaps, depending on how all that works out in the meta and how aggressive these decks can be, it really might make the difference that just, 1 out of 5 times, 1 out of 10 times that Druid can't stabilize behind Spreading Plague because it costs that 1 extra mana, and maybe that's enough to hurt their win rate to knock Druid down a peg or two and kind of restore some balance to the meta. So I do like how subtle this change is. I don't think it breaks the card. I think Spreading Plague is still pretty powerful at 6 mana. But, there's all kinds of interactions and math and timings and all of these different variables that go into calculating how good a card is in a specific meta. So it could still be a very impactful change, although I don't think immediately it will. I think Spreading Plague will still get played, and I think slow Jade Druid will still be a good deck. So this might actually be a reasonably subtle, graceful change for Blizzard instead of absolutely killing the card. I guess we'll need more time and more data to really understand just how big of an impact this one has. Maybe it didn't go far enough, but I think in combination with Innervate and this slight nerf to Spreading Plague, it might be just enough to curtail the Druid problem on the ranked ladder as we understand it today, and that's a very good thing. So that said, let's move on to the nerfs that certainly surprised me, and I think have surprised a lot of people. There were 3 non-Druid cards nerfed, the first of which I want to talk about is Fiery War Axe. Now, obviously, Fiery War Axe has historically been, in my opinion, maybe the best card in Hearthstone. You don't think about just a vanilla weapon getting such a designation, you think about the big legendaries and stuff, but it has just always been a prominent card in the meta. Warrior has always been, whether it was Pirate or Control, one of the top tier decks in Hearthstone. I can't really remember any metas where Warrior didn't have some sort of high tier, really influential deck. And it didn't matter if it was a fast one or a slow one, Fiery War Axe was a tool in both kinds of archetypes for Warrior. Most recently, of course, we see it in Pirate Warrior, and it's obviously a strong card. Hitting Fiery War Axe on turn 2, it's gotten the nickname Fiery Win Axe, because if you draw it on turn 2, there's a good chance it's going to lead you towards winning the game. And everybody's known that for a really long time, but despite that, it never, to me, felt like a problem card. It just felt like part of Hearthstone, just the kind of card that it's just, you expect it, it's strong, but it's not overpowered, it doesn't do anything crazy. It's just a reasonably statted weapon for its cost. It's strong, of course, but reasonable, understood, just a part of Warrior's identity and the balance of Warrior. Everything else has kind of been built around Fiery War Axe and how strong it is, and all the other sort of mana cost allocations for other things are built around this. And this change is incredibly significant. I mean, just a huge nerf. 3 mana, 3/2 weapons are played by other classes, yes. Eaglehorn Bow is played by Hunters even when they don't play Secrets. Rallying Blade has been played by Paladins even when they didn't really have any big Divine Shield synergies. They were often just happy to play a 3 mana, 3/2 weapon. We've seen examples of that. Shadow Blade for Rogues now. It's the kind of card you can run even if you don't necessarily care about saving your life. 3 mana, 3/2 is a stat line for weapons that's playable, but Fiery War Axe is distinctly worse than all of those examples I gave you because it's a vanilla card. It has no upside. There's no bonus attached to it like those other examples. So it's immediately worse than those now. It's also just strictly worse than King's Defender, the old Warrior card from the Grand Tournament. You might not remember this, but it essentially got an extra durability if you had a taunt minion on board when you played it. Or I don't even remember the exact text, but something like that. So just absolutely strictly worse than King's Defender, which is sad because Fiery War Axe has just been such an iconic Hearthstone card. If you name like the top 5 most played Hearthstone cards, I bet this one is up there and probably maybe even number 1. historically on Hearthstone. So I can see Blizzard using that as an example for why it's a problem. If they design other cards around it, it's the most played, it leads to strong win rates. All of those are logical explanations for this one, but I don't think anybody out there felt like this card was too good. So it's still surprising to me. I think we've all just come to know it and come to understand it, and if you're a warrior, you've come to mulligan for it on turn 2 and loved when you saw it on turn 2, but still didn't seem like a problem card to me. Now, the effect this is going to have, clearly, Fire War Axe is far less good. There's a lot of 3 health things that you like to kill on turn 2, or sometimes even on turn 1, if you could coin this out. The Mana Worms of the world, all the different Murlocs that come out early in games. There's just a lot of 3 health targets, so this coming a turn later means Warrior has way less tools in the early game to survive, so this actually hurts Control Warrior kinds of decks, not just Pirate Warriors, but of course it also hurts Pirate Warriors. You can no longer do things like coin a Fire War Axe into a Blood Sail that gets buffed into a 5/3, and then you can also not play the Cultist on turn 3 after your Fire War Axe. That whole curve gets blown up, because now you got a Fire War Axe on 3, and then you Cultist on 4, and you're floating in mana, and it's weird. So clearly, Pirate Warriors don't want to spend an extra mana point for the same amount of damage. So this is a monstrous hit to Pirate Warrior. Frankly, I think it might actually kill Pirate Warriors. I don't know if they can survive this. I mean, they still have other ways to curve out that are very powerful, but they might have to go more minion-based, and right now minion-based decks are just not good against the Druid Onslaught and all the taunts and stuff that are out there. So having that weapon to push through and just go really tall as far as damage was concerned was great for Pirates, and this is a big hit to that game plan. So, I mean, I don't think you can underestimate how much of a nerf this is. And by the way, it might still be played. I'm not saying Fire War Axe won't be played. It might be. I don't know if Pirates will play it, because I don't know if Pirates can survive with it. But I bet Control decks still play this, just because, like I said, a 3-mana 3/2 is not terrible. But man, everything else that Warrior is built around, and how we understand the class and the strengths of it are all fed in and tied into that fact that they have such a strong early game removal option with Fire War Axe. And when you take that away, when you slow it down, what do they fill in the gaps with? Their turn 2 is traditionally pretty terrible without Fire War Axe, because their hero power often doesn't contribute to the board. It's a really passive and slow hero power. So this is a huge gap to fill for Warrior. I'm a little bit sad to see this change. I think it's going to change a lot about how we see Hearthstone right now, but also it's going to make some waves in the future for Warrior as we build future Control Warrior decks, and the shape of the class and the identity of the class is going to look a lot different in the future of Hearthstone, that's for sure. So that was a lot to say about that card. Whew, it's because I'm still kind of reeling, right? I haven't had a whole lot of time to process these nerfs. So let's move on to the next one. Another surprise and another iconic classic card getting changed here. And this time it's Hex for Shaman, and essentially just turning Hex into Polymorph. It's a subtle change, but you know, it was always a little weird that Hex cost 3 mana and Polymorph cost 4 for Mage, even though they did basically the same thing. Hex was arguably slightly better because the minion you summoned didn't have an attack value, but it also had taunt, and that could be troublesome from time to time. But now Hex is basically Polymorph, just, you know, again, the minion you transform it into is slightly different. And this is clearly a nerf, but I actually don't think it's that significant a one. I think Shaman would happily run Hex at 4 mana, like a Control Shaman, for instance. You know, the ability to slot in additional mana here or there probably isn't that impactful. Usually when you're playing Hex, it was most of your turn or the most important thing you were doing on your turn, and everything else was sort of secondary. So I think this card is still considerably viable, since, you know, it is a transform, a silence that's really, really powerful. And I think it's sad, unfortunately, that Shaman was always one of the strongest basic card sets, in my opinion. So, you know, when I make budget decks for people, and I always liked making Shaman because I was like, man, you can drop Hex in here. Hex is one of the best removal spells in the game, and it's available for free as a part of the basic set. So it doesn't matter what cards your opponent has, whether they have the Tyrion, whether they have the Lich King, all these legendaries, guess what? You can put them on equal footing with you because you have Hex. So super cheap, awesome, one of the best cards in the game. And suddenly now it's nerfed. And I guess you can actually say the same thing for Fire War Axe. Unfortunately, another basic card gets nerfed. So This is a little bit of a punch in the gut to budget players and people trying to build decks on a really strict budget. Now, that's not your everyday Hearthstone player, but people who are new to the game suddenly just got weaker options. All these basic cards now look considerably worse compared to cards from new expansions. I hate to say this, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, I don't really like that idea, but maybe that's part of the logic for Blizzard, is sort of shepherding people into the newer cards so they have to buy packs. I hate having to say that, because I don't think that's the case. I think legitimately Blizzard thinks these changes are good for the game, and I have good faith in them. But it does hurt budget players, that's for sure. And, you know, Hex is not being played right now necessarily very often, so it's hard to say how this is going to impact the meta right now. Clearly just makes the card a little bit weaker, which makes every future iteration of Shaman that runs Hex just a little bit slower and a little bit harder to work with. But clearly Blizzard has something in mind. This was not a card anybody had a problem with. I don't think anyone's ever mentioned Hex as a troublesome card or a card that frustrated them, at least not lately. So maybe they've got some stuff planned. They want to move away from transformations or silences of some sort to make a card like Hex a little less playable. So it's hard to read into that too much, but clearly Blizzard had some data or some logic to support this change. Doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but it's not bad. Hex is still playable, so ultimately I'm okay with this one. And then finally, one last change here. This one's Murloc Warleader. No longer giving additional Murlocs +1 health, only +2 attack. And I think this is a reasonable change. Murloc Warleader is clearly a very powerful card. Whenever you're playing against a Murloc deck, like half of your decisions have to go around the fact that you have to calculate how to handle a Murloc Warleader. Like if they play a Warleader and you can't answer it, you just 97% of the time lose the game. So you sort of have to make so many decisions around this card. And part of the reason for that is because once it gets on board, it just makes it so hard to deal with everything else. It sets up so many good trades. And the +1 health does contribute to that pretty significantly. You know, when they play that Vile Spin and it's a Vile Spine and it's a 1/3, and then the Warleader comes out and suddenly it's a 3/4, and you're like, wait a minute, what? That's a crazy minion just for, you know, getting on board buffs. I can't handle a 3/4, and it makes some ridiculous trade into your Mana Worm or whatever it might be, and you just never get the chance to come back because that one play snowballed the board so significantly. If this gets nerfed, or it is getting nerfed, I should say. So since this gets nerfed, those health buffs go away. Trades don't become quite as favorable. I mean, yes, you can still trade up, but often it's going to be sacrificing the Murloc that does trade up. So it'll be less about snowballing these ridiculous Murloc boards, which also cuts into the synergy of the Megasaur plays and everything else. So don't underestimate the impact of this. It still makes the hyper-aggressive Murloc strategy where you just hammer face very viable, but it makes the board-based, really sticky Murloc plan a little bit harder to execute thanks to this change. So it still leaves that opening for Murlocs to be powerful and be strong and be hyper-aggressive, but it limits their application, I think, in slightly slower or more mid-range decks, which is where they've been popular lately with Paladin, which is a good change. I think Murlocs as a tribe, as a race, need that more hyper-aggressive swarm-style mentality and less of the value mentality that they were starting to develop in Paladin. So I actually like this change. Murloc Warleader still has an identity, still a strong card, just cuts back on some of the raw power that Murlocs were getting when they all bunched together, and I think that's a fine change. So there you go, guys. 5 new nerfs. Hearthstone's going to look very different with Innervate nerfed, with Fiery War Axe nerfed. Hex probably doesn't change much. Murloc Warleader nerf will also change a lot too. Basically, the 3 best decks in the game right now, I would argue Murloc Paladin. Well, honestly, the 4 best decks. Both versions of Druid, Murloc Paladin, and Pirate Warrior are all getting nerfed via these changes. Now, Shaman, I don't know why they got tossed in. Unfortunately, they're just doing okay, and Hex is not even being played. That one was probably an afterthought. But the other 4 decks all getting nerfed, which means the meta is going to change. Now, it's really hard to speculate how that's going to happen, what's going to change, how it's going to look. But it does open up some space for other decks to shine and show up and supplant these decks. So that's cool. And I think maybe Druid does get taken down a peg or two. Still a strong class, which is good. It doesn't need to be nerfed into non-existence. It just needs to be nerfed. And I think this is a subtle enough, slight enough change that Druid will still exist, but it won't be the class you see every single game on the ladder. So all that said, guys, if you have any thoughts, comments, observations, theories on these nerfs, I would love to hear them. I know I rambled a bit, but that's just because there's a lot to talk about and a lot to think about. These are really significant changes. Hopefully you enjoyed my insights a little bit. I know I would love to hear your insights in turn, so please do leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.